This is actually precisely where I'd like to begin this morning in considering this key passage in Exodus. With this question, what details about the commands of God do we assume to be true, but perhaps aren't really what the text teaches? Suppose we were to go out on the streets and poll people about the Big Ten, and I'm not talking football, from the Old Testament. How would they talk about the Ten Commandments? How would they characterize them? Most would undoubtedly see the Ten Commands as restrictions or prohibitions, God's demands restricting the freedom of his followers. So, to begin today, I'd like to challenge that idea, and in keeping with our underlying freedom theme of our series in Exodus, I'd like to assert that these 10 words, literally the Decalogue, the 10 words, are an expression of deep love from God to his people. And in reality, these words are the key to a life characterized by freedom and joy rather than restriction and misery. These 10 commands are not evidence that God is the great cosmic killjoy, intent on ruining the fun and taking enjoyment out of being human. Rather, they are an expression of love. Like a parent cautioning her child, don't play with fire. Look both ways before beginning to navigate a busy street. Always wear your seatbelt. Don't touch the stove when it's hot. Be careful around broken glass. Why is she saying these things? To control and restrict her child? To ruin the fun? No. It's because each of these scenarios represents potential harm or pain for the child. And she says these out of love for the child. In the same way, these 10 commands do the same. The first command, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. The second one, you shall not make yourself a graven image. 3, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. 4, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. 5, honor your father and mother. 6, no murder. 7, no adultery. 8, no stealing. 9, no lies about your neighbor. The 10th, no lusting after your neighbor's house or your wife or servant or maid or ox or donkey. Don't set your heart on anything that's your neighbor's. These are all guidelines by the one who created humans and therefore knows them best. So in a sense, these 10 commands are like an owner's manual for how to live well on this earth. But I still think the best metaphor is the way a mom talks to her kids to protect them because she loves them. And therefore, one way to receive these commands is the way that an obedient child listens to mom or dad in childlike trust. We'll come back to that in a minute. But now, in terms of how the commands are organized, I think it's good to note that there are 2 groups of commands. They're sometimes referred to as the 2 tables of the law. And commands 1 through 4 have to do with our relationship with God. And commands 5 through 10 with our relationships with each other. And this is the way that Jesus understood them when he was asked about the laws and which one is the most important. Jesus replied by summarizing the first table of the law this way. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then he summarized the second table by answering, love your neighbor as yourself. So if you do these two things, you will be keeping the 10 commands, and indeed you will fulfill all the words of the law and the prophets, said Jesus. Matthew 22. But back to this theme of the 10 commands being an expression of love. To me, there really is no, there's one command that illustrates this truth beautifully. And it's also the one command that I believe is the most often broken by followers of Jesus in this time and in this place. In fact, when we talk to each other, we often admit to it, even sometimes boastfully, that we disregard this one command. Even our religious leaders are often heard admitting to it. I'd like to take the rest of my time this morning to focus on that one. In this culture, we may not necessarily obey the other 9, but at least we acknowledge them. This one command, we ignore and we break it. As if it weren't even there. We disregard it and we forget it. And the consequences of this command boycott are all around us. People's lives are destroyed. Families are broken up. And whole communities damaged by it. And you want to know the tragic part of this? Today's Christian religious leaders and pastors seem to be leading the charge in this disobedience. Now, do you know which command I'm talking about? Do you think you know which one it is? Stealing? False witness? Adultery? Murder? What is it? It's the 4th commandment. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. If someone were to ask many of us to name the 10 commandments, we could probably name some of them, but most of us would probably forget that 4th command. It is, I believe, the most ignored commandment, not to mention my opinion, the most violated. It's a command that points out the importance of rest. But we've been sucked into a frantic society. We are frantic about work. We are frantic about family life. We're frantic about exercise. We're even frantic about leisure. It's go, 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 go all the time. Just look around. You can see it. And this is true of our culture more than any other era before us and all the cultures of the world. Do you realize that? Do some travel. Go to some other places in the world. You don't see what you see here in America and a lot of other places in the world. Why is that? Well, one explanation is that we have forgotten the Sabbath. And yet, God calls us to remember the Sabbath. It's the only command where he says, remember it. In fact, he has more to say about the Sabbath than almost all the other ones. Now, again, you might have an idea about what the Sabbath is. Again, I encourage you to not let our preconceived concept get in the way of what God is intending for his beloved people. I want to suggest that remembering the Sabbath and keeping it holy actually means regularly scheduled, disciplined disengagement from productivity, from self-sufficiency, from the sin habits of self-importance. Self-sufficiency and self-importance are what we get when we work endlessly. We're being productive. We're taking care of our needs. We're being important. Sabbath keeping is taking a break from that. Ceasing work for 24 hours to remember who it is who really takes care of us. Now, keeping the Sabbath is, granted, it's extremely hard to do. Our whole culture these days, and even it seems the whole church, is often against us in this. So, really, how does it look? What is it, Sabbath keeping? I want to say that it's really an opposite way of looking at time. Remember the creation story? 7 days of creation. God created light on day 1. Day 2, the atmosphere and the firmament. Day 3, the dry ground and the plants. Day 4, the sun, the moon, the stars. Day 5, birds and the sea creatures. Day 6, humans were created. And what happens on the 7th day? Yeah, rest. So the humans are created on day 6. The first thing they do is rest. Now, this is a vastly different idea than the world's concept of work, where you work first and then you earn rest or you earn a vacation. To keep the Sabbath is not merely to take a day off, it is to understand and live on God's time, which is different than the world's time. We do our work out of rest. We live our lives out of the Sabbath. And one aspect of this is that we have a different view of time. For the most part, we don't understand time. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, we're much better at understanding space. We have space exploration, but no one's doing time exploration. God's call to Sabbath keeping is a call to see time differently, to see it God's way. The word Shabbat in Hebrew means literally to cease or to stop or to cut it out. The way it's been expressed by one person is this, that the Sabbath means not doing anything that you feel you should, you ought to, you have to, or you must. In your life, the shoulds, ought tos, have to, or musts. For 24 hours, you step away from those things. It's a day for mostly praying and playing. Now, two things need to be said right away. First, there are seasons of life when Sabbath keeping is especially challenging, and one is when you have small children in your life. I have heard of families that do some creative things around this. Families who actually are in fellowship together, they help each other, like once or twice a month by sharing responsibilities with kids and doing creative things that way. I think that's a good thing. But there are some times in your life where it's going to be tough. And so the second thing I think it's important thing to say is that I'm not advocating a legalistic approach to Sabbath keeping. I think we saw enough of that about 50 and more years ago in our country. The blue laws, when there was a lot of things you couldn't do on Sundays. The command does not read, keep the Sabbath perfectly. It's not about that. But we need to keep in mind what the purpose of Sabbath keeping is. Sabbath is a day to step back from the lie that we are indispensable and to behold the glory of God. Just as God stepped back from creation on day 7 and looked at it all and said, "This is good." We can do the same thing on the Sabbath. To step away from our work and to behold the glory of God. Now, this may sound fairly simple, but in reality, it takes a lot of faith. Most of us have this tendency to think that our world will fall apart if we don't keep running on the treadmill of responsibility. Is it because we're afraid to let someone down? Is it because we don't want to be called unsuccessful? I mean, take a moment and be honest with yourself. Deep down, do you believe that you're the only one who can accomplish what needs to be done? I have one question for you. What about God's capability? When we lift ourselves to that level of responsibility, what does that really say about God? Remember where we started all this? With parents and children? Kids learning to listen to their parents because they love them. This is that childlike trust that we as parents hope our kids will have some of anyway. Do you and I dare to apply this here as well? Is God capable of taking care of us, even when we are at rest? Sabbath keeping involves a great deal of trust. You may feel panic to set aside one day to be unproductive, but it's a panic that could lead eventually to an understanding of God's time. Have you ever seen videos of Hebrew Jewish homes at the beginning of Sabbath? There's a scene in the movie. What can I think of the movie? Fiddler on the Roof, yeah. Where there's all these different families beginning Sabbath, and the women of the house, they light candles, and they do this over the candles. Have you ever seen this? It's a gathering in of the holiness of the day, of holy time, a gathering in of God's time. We don't quite get this. God knew it would be, I think, this way for us, and this is why He gave us the gift of the Sabbath. You know, this is more than just taking a day off. It's letting this sense of God's time enter into the rest of your life. One writer said it this way: anyone can observe Sabbath, but making it holy surely takes the rest of the week. So how about you? Do you have some growing to do here? How will you know? Here's one way. Think about a day, a normal non-work day, without your cell phone, your computer, and without your watch or any other kind of clock at all. How does that make you feel? Frightened? You probably have a ways to go. And to be honest with you, I know I do. So let's consider this word from the Old Testament. It's the best way to grow into understanding God's time. The fourth commandment: remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. It's my prayer that you will discover the joy of this, that your life will be full of good things, but that you will have the rest that you need, that you will rediscover relationships, that in your Sabbath keeping you'll find time for prayer. In fact, let's pray for these things right now. Bow with me.